So how do you go about doing UX work? Well, there are several processes, methods that are out there that are popular and different organizations use as part of the UX work. And I want to talk through 4 of the most popular ones. If you are out there looking for a UX job, you will probably encounter one of these 4 terms at some point, and maybe all of them during your career. First, let me say that I think there are some elements, no matter what the process is, there are some elements that are important in whichever process is being followed in the organization. And I wanted to just share with you the 4 ideas of what I think is really important in a process in order for great UX work to occur. So the first one is there has to be some amount of user research, and we're going to see that the amount of user research varies a lot depending on the process you're following, but also just from organization to organization and even project to project. Some projects have room and time and budget for a lot of user research, and some projects have very little. So this varies a lot. And you'll also find disagreement with some people saying, oh, you don't need that much user research, and some people saying, oh, you need tons and tons of it. But let's just say for our purposes here that an effective UX process is going to have some amount of user research built in. The next one is prototyping and iteration. All of the design processes that we're going to talk about all assume that that during the design process there's going to be places where you prototype the user experience and where you can iterate and change the user experience. So that's a real important part of a process for designing a great user experience. Thirdly is collaboration. The idea that the UX professional, no matter how good and experienced they are, is not and should not be working alone. They need to be collaborating with others, whether that's collaborating with their stakeholders, whether that's collaborating with other designers, whether that's collaborating to get feedback from users, whether that's collaborating with the programmers and developers. If you want to have a great user experience, you need to work with others. And the last one I want to mention that is maybe not quite so common and maybe somewhat controversial, but I think is very important, that there be a dedicated UX role on the project, that someone on the project is assigned to be the one that's looking out for the user experience. And I mentioned this as when we were talking about the principles about how the humans have to come up first. It's really not going to happen. It's really hard to create a great user experience if you don't have at least one person whose job it is to be dedicated to the user experience of this product. And some people say, oh, well, everyone should be dedicated to the user experience, so that you don't need a dedicated role because everyone on the project, whether it's the stakeholder or the programmer or whoever it is, they're always keeping the user experience in mind. And that's a great thing to say, but in reality, that's not what happens, right? If I'm working on the visual design, I'm going to get caught up in the visual design. If I'm working on the programming, I'm going to get caught up in the programming. If I'm responsible for implementing and distributing the product once it's created, I'm going to get caught up in that. And so that means that the user experience is not top of anyone's mind. It's a secondary thing in everyone's mind, and that's not enough. So you need at least one person whose job on that project is to care about the user experience, and they don't have any other role they have to do on that project. That's all they have to do. So those are the elements, I think, of an effective process. Do they allow you to do these 4 things? Now let's take a look at what I said were the 4 most common and popular processes and methods you're likely to find out there. And interestingly, actually only one of them is really a UX process. The rest are processes for doing related things, and they are processes that a UX professional is often involved in, but they're not actually UX processes. And I think sometimes there's confusion about that. So let's start with talking about Agile. Agile is probably the most common process that you're going to find out there. If you're a UX professional and you are looking for a job or you have a job, you will run into Agile. You will be asked to do what's called Agile UX. You will be asked to do UX work on an Agile project. I think the estimate is something like 80% of organizations use Agile. But Agile is not actually a UX process. It was not designed as a UX process, and it's still not a UX process. And again, this is one of those areas of terminology and possible controversy. Agile is a process for developing a product, especially developing a software product. And it is all about how you develop the software, design and develop the software. It is not about how you design and develop the user experience. Now, if you're going to design and develop software or an app or a product, at some point it is likely that you need an interface on top of that, and so you absolutely will be designing the user experience. Someone's going to be designing the user experience. And if you're following the Agile methodology to design and develop the product or the software, then whoever is designing the interface or the user experience of that is going to be part of the Agile process too. But they're really trying to do their UX work inside the Agile process. So Agile was developed in the late 1990s. It's very popular because it's a very effective way to deal with especially complex development and software projects. I don't have anything against Agile except that it really was not designed and is often not implemented with UX that much in mind. And the hallmarks of Agile are, we don't have time to go, this is not a course on Agile, but just to give you an idea, the idea behind Agile, some of the ideas behind Agile is that you break up the work into small units or pieces, about 2 to 3 weeks long typically, and that at the end of each of these sprints, they're called, you have an actual working piece of code, and it helps turn these large, complicated development projects that used to take literally years, turn them into something more manageable and a much quicker process. But it does not necessarily allow for a lot of user research or UX iteration and so on. And so there are challenges in doing UX work within an Agile process. It can be done, but there are some challenges. So just know that if you are hired to do UX work on an Agile project, you're going to have to dig in and find out what they think that means and how much time do you have to do your work, because typically you're going to be working in small pieces and you're not going to have necessarily a lot of time to do user research unless you do all of that ahead of time. But that's for another course. That's for an Agile UX course. So Agile is the most popular methodology out there for developing software, and you may very well be asked to fit your UX work into an Agile process. The second process we're going to talk about is one called design thinking. And just as we said, Agile is not really a UX process. Design thinking is not a UX process either. It's a design process. Very popular, very popular in terms of design. Not necessary. It's not about design. It's not about creating software. So you typically you may or may not find design thinking in the IT department, but you might. And it's all about a process or a methodology for coming up with ideas of how to solve a particular problem and designing based on what users need, which sounds a lot like user experience. But often it has to do not just with designing the interaction, the interface, but just what product should we even create. And so it's design thinking is a larger design process than just designing the user interface or the user experience of a particular product. It asks the question, what product should we even have? But UX is often part of the design thinking process. The design thinking process has really specific ways, especially that they want to do user research. So if you are a UX person on a design thinking process, just know that they're going to have very specific ways they want to do that user research. Typically, I find the UX process can fit quite well within design thinking, as long as you understand kind of the special things they want to do as part of the design thinking process. The third process that we're going to mention is called Lean, and this also is not a UX process. This is also a design process specifically for designing products or services. But UX is asked often to fit into Lean, and it fits fairly well. So Lean, by the way, is not as popular or widespread as Agile or design thinking is. So you will likely run into it less often than you will run into Agile or design thinking. But the main idea behind Lean is that you do a constant series of what's called hypothesis testing. Lean also involves making decisions about products at a high level, not just designing the user experience part, but what should the product be, what should the product do, how do we solve this problem. But the way Lean works is you come up with a hypothesis. So maybe you come up with a question about, do we think that we can deliver our medical services totally online with minimizing in-person clinic visits? And so we might come up with a hypothesis that says people will be comfortable with speaking to their medical team through the internet. That's okay with people, and that's a hypothesis. And so we're going to test that hypothesis before we continue on with this product we're thinking of designing. So as part of testing that hypothesis, there might be a user experience and interface that you need to design. Maybe we're going to prototype something so that we can go show it to people and get their feedback in order to test that hypothesis. So typically the UX role is building these prototypes that you need, because you're going to be doing a lot of different hypothesis testing. And then the last process that we're going to talk about is the only UX process really in here. It's often called User-Centered Design, so you may hear it called UCD. And that is a UX process. It's the only one that is. And basically, we've kind of alluded to it already in the course, but basically a user-centered design process says, look, if we're going to design the user experience of a product or a service, what we're going to do is we're going to start with doing user research. We're going to do as much of it as we have time and budget for and is best for this kind of project. We're going to start with user research. Then we're going to do design, which I'm going to say is split into a high-level conceptual model design and a detailed interaction design. And we're going to make sure that we do lots of user testing during the design process and then at the end of the design process, and we're going to be iterating. And that's really a basic user-centered design process. It's the one that is best for doing UX work. It's the one that you can sometimes embed into these other things. So I can do a little mini version of user-centered design within my Agile work, within my Lean work, within my design thinking work. But if someone says to you, yes, we do we follow a UCD process, then you know that they are following a very typical user experience process: research, high-level design, detailed design, user testing.